When we talk about teams, especially in the context of each other, it's not enough to talk about them purely individually and outline what they're good at, what the strengths of the team are, who the good players are, what the system they use is. I think it's also important to kind of be able to talk about them relative to each other and to model where they all fit within a hierarchy. And so one of the key concepts that I have for creating such a hierarchy is a concept that's essentially like a tier system. So when we model teams, we want to model how good they are versus our expectations of them, what teams are above them, what teams are below them, who are in their peer group. And so if you ever notice the way I talk about teams and the way I write about teams, I have very consistent terminology. Because this is something that I thought about the language, the semantics of how we discuss things in gaming and how we structure our thoughts and model them, and also how we convey them to other people. And I thought to myself, if you're just throwing around terms like very good, excellent, fantastic, phenomenal, and they're just doing it in a willy-nilly manner, then it's going to become incredibly muddied, not just to someone who doesn't know much about the game, but someone who might know a lot about the game, but might not know much about you. And so might not know what those terms mean to you and how often you use them and what your internal dictionary is for which player you'd use that for, but who you wouldn't use that for, and what the gap between is and what would make that up. So one term that I think is very important and has always been a key word for me is the term elite. And I take elite to be the best of the best. This is the top status you can have as a player or a team in the game. And specifically in this video, I want to talk about what it means if you're an elite team. So at the moment, a lot of fans use the tier system, but they just literally call people tier 1 teams, tier 2 teams, tier 3 teams. And the problem with that is everyone does it, but no one agrees upon how many teams are in a tier. What do you have to do to be in tier 1? Is it placings? Is it how good you seem as a team? How long does it last over? When do you lose tier status? We don't know any of these things and they're too vague. And so as a result, some people's tier 1 has 15 teams in it. Some people's tier 1 might still have teams that were good 3 months ago but aren't so good anymore. Some people's tier 1 might be only the top 5 or 6 teams. We don't really know. And since everyone's using this terminology, because it's very vague, that's why people think in discussions on forums and Reddit that actually they're understanding each other. But if they actually sat down and said, oh, and so by tier 1 you did mean this, the person went, no, I don't mean that at all. So we need to get some of this clear. We need to have some definitions for ourselves. So you'll hear me use the term tier 1. Now personally, the way I conceive of tier 1, the way I model it, is generally tier 1 for me is my top 10. Now, as you'll see with elite status, it's not as clear cut as that. Sometimes I might have 12 teams who I think are tier 1. Sometimes I think actually the top 10 is a little bit weaker or weaker at the bottom end. Like there's just all teams there where one of them finished 7th in an event, another one got a best of 1 upset over someone, and someone had a best of 3 but never went deep. And it's like I'm having to differentiate between them. So sometimes there might be a scenario where only 8 teams would be considered by me a tier 1. And even though someone crept into 9th place, I still consider them tier 2. So in general, roughly my top 10 is tier 1 for me. And then tier 2 for me, likewise, I mean, I don't have to go much lower because I don't talk about tier 3 much, but I usually make tier 2 roughly like the 11th best team to the 20th best team as a rough guide. Again, remember, if it's really bad, maybe there's only 6 teams in tier 2, whatever it may be. Now, I think it's actually important, since the best teams in the world, the ones that are going to make it the deepest, and thus the ones we're going to discuss the most, are the best teams. This is the elite tier. So for me, I mean, I use tier 1 as that general way because I'm trying to actually fit in with what other people are doing, but mine's a little bit more defined to me personally. But I have elite tier, and elite tier is above even tier 1. And so what I do for elite tier is funny. I already started doing this myself when I wrote about Counter-Strike. I would only call teams elite if they were some of the best or capable of winning big events. But there's actually some terminology that I found in StarCraft Brood War, the game that was played in Korea for like 12 years, which fits in basically with what I thought of as elite, that I was already using this terminology for, and they'd invented it for the same reason. So they had a term called S tier, and the way they did tiers was S tier was the highest possible tier, and those were like the best players in the world who were super good, and you know they were in prime form and they were incredible skill level and they were above everyone else. And then the next tier was like A tier, and this was like pretty good, you know, you were a good player, above average, like a solid player on a team. And then there was B tier, and it went down like that. Now, I thought this was great. My equivalent was elite. The problem is that terminology in StarCraft was unfortunately ruined because it was picked up by StarCraft 2 and the tournament GSL, the GOM TV Star League, StarCraft 2 League or whatever. Unfortunately, they started calling essentially their version of an OSL, like the teams that people that qualify for their version of OSL, the GSL, they called everyone who was in that top division Code S. So because they were using the S, and that's similar to S tier, people stopped using the term S tier. They just started saying Code S. And the problem is, same exact scenarios, people using tier 1 now as opposed to my elite status, is that now you have like 32 players who are S tier, whereas that's the whole point of S tier. S tier was always like, there would be like 4 S tier or 8 S tier players. And these were really set aside. They were the elite level players who were better than even the very good or the good players, who might have occasional runs of form. So now that S tier has been ruined, and there's probably no point introducing it into another game, and especially not in StarCraft when they've already got the whole Code S thing going on, I'm going to bring back elite tier for other people because I already use it and I'm consistent with it. But I want other people to have this in mind for when they model the game. So for me, here's what makes up elite teams. Elite teams are, first and foremost, the best in the world. Like, you have to be probably the worst you could be to be elite tier is probably top 6 in the world. Maybe it can get down to there could be 6 or 7 elite teams. It's very unlikely in general if you look at how the game goes. But let's say it was a very, very competitive era. Maybe there could be 6 or 7. So you've got to be really among the best in the world. They have to play at a high level with some degree of consistency. You can't just have one-off tournament that was really good. Like, for example, Cloud9 just made it all the way and won EPL, a big 250k or more tournament. They're not considered elite tier to me. Even if they got up to placing, they're 5th place in my rankings. They're not elite tier. There's still a gap between them and the teams that I consider elite tier. And I'll go into who I think is elite tier at the moment as an example for you in Counter-Strike. So you have to be the best, among the best in the world. You have to play at a very high level, but with some consistency. You can have the odd tournament off like Na'Vi and VP have had, but in general, you've got to be pretty consistent to maintain your elite status. Otherwise, you drop out. You've got to be capable of, in theory, winning any tournament. Now, teams like G2 earlier in the year, SK, VP now, Na'Vi, in theory, these teams can all win any tournament. Obviously, G2 now can't, but they did before. So there's an example of someone who's Fallout tier, elite tier. And also, there's a final way to clarify, but be slightly different in our criteria. They should be the favourites or very much among the favourites to win any tournament they enter. So as in, if you're a really good team and you have a chance, like Cloud9 did, to win EPL, but the only reason you have a good chance to win it, or a decent chance, is because there's no VP, there's no nothing, then you're not elite tier. That's the problem. The difference is, people like Na'Vi doing if they go to a tournament that has all the best teams in the world, the top 10 ranking are all there, they're still among the favourites to win the tournament. That's elite tier. That's where you got at that level. And also, I'd add as a second level, as a last component, which kind of is just a different way of phrasing out the play at the very high level with some consistency. So, okay, there might have been periods in time where Virtus.pro was elite tier, but they weren't winning that many tournaments, or they would only win the odd tournament. But the point is, still, every time they met those really big teams, in general, they gave them a really competitive match, and they were, as a result, showing that high level of play. So that person goes on and wins the tournament, and they're the best team, but they battled them and showed that they were like a peer of theirs. The idea of being elite tier is you're a peer of the best team in the world, in theory, okay? So if there's a big gap between you, and I don't just mean as in the best team beats you, because you can have mismatches in terms of stylistic matchup, but in general, you have to be a peer of those top teams to be the elite tier, in my opinion. Now, a key detail that I've already referenced and alluded to before, but I'll now explicitly state, is there is a big difference between having a high ranking and having elite status. Because for me, because of the criteria I've listed above, the number of elite teams there are in the world varies. Teams drop out of elite tier, they go into elite tier, and so as a result, there could be 2 elite teams, there could be 5 elite teams, there could be 7 elite teams. Depends on the era. Whereas, obviously, there will always be 6 teams in the top 6 in the rankings. But the point is, if the rankings are weaker, then you can end up with a period, like I actually think now, where sure, there are a lot of good teams, there are a lot of teams that are verging on elite tier, but they're not quite. And so for me, there aren't necessarily as many as there might have been in the past. So I'll give you an example of when was quite a competitive era. And this was in autumn of 2015, last year. And it was running into when we had ESL 1 Cologne and then the period just after. So at this period in time, we had Envious was winning tons of tournaments, was a favourite for the major. We had TSM was winning tournaments, placing very highly consistently. They were a potential favourite for the major. We had Virtus.pro. They hadn't won a tournament in a while. They did obviously go on to win Dubai, They won Dubai, now they had that big run, and then they were always having top places and playing people consistently. And we had Fnatic, sure, who weren't at that point in time going to win tournaments. It looked like they dropped a little bit off, but they could always play those other teams close and give them a tough test. So we had 4 elite teams at the time. Now at the moment, funnily enough, I think you could make a case that we have 4 elite teams now. We have Virtus.pro. Okay, Virtus.pro only won 1 event in the last few months. Yeah, they finished second place, all the other ones. They finished top placings, a whole bunch of them. This is really impressive shit. They can win any tournament. They're a favourite for any tournament, and they're very consistent, and they play everyone really, really well. You've got Dignitas. Sure, they've only just now won a big tournament, but if you look at the last few months, they were primed to become elite tier, and now they've become elite tier. And they've got the resume to back it up with the consistent play, playing people close, and now they win big events. Now they're elite tier. We've got Na'Vi. We know they've won a big event. They've only lost to the champion at the Epicenter. They've played very well against everyone. The consistency's there. The placings are there. The capability to win an event, to be a favourite, that's certainly there. And I would say, still at the moment, I would rank SK as elite tier. Now, the problem with that is SK are the ones that are hanging on by a thread. They're still having deep placings, still finishing top 4 minimum every event. They just made the final of EPL. They're still playing people close in big games. Admittedly, they got a little bit blown up by Cloud9, but they still had the map that they won. And in general, they're of a pretty high level still. So they're hanging on, they've got a couple of criteria that are starting to come unraveled, but they're just hanging on. And for all we know, they could still win the next event. It's not ridiculous to say that they will. They're not really out of the favourites entirely, even though they're more questionable. So those are my elite tier at the moment. Sure, Dignitas and Na'Vi also have to prove it with some more big placings, but at the moment they've got the elite status. And as I said, SK can drop out. I mean, particularly one thing that's a big knock on SK is that they did lose the best of 3 final to C9. Here's the difference. VP is losing tournaments to Dignitas, Na'Vi, elite tier teams. SK before EPL was only losing to Virtus.pro in best of 3, so that's fine. Losing to Cloud9, who weren't that highly ranked and who weren't elite in that sense, that is a knock on them and shows that maybe there's something going on there. So this is something to watch in the future, because they're a team that will drop out, and you won't see me calling them elite anymore if they drop out of that status. So at the moment, in my top 10, even though Cloud9's ranked 5th, the 4 teams above them are elite status at the moment, and Cloud9 haven't proved that yet. I mean, look through my criteria. Are they the best in the world, among the best in the world? Not really. They haven't truly shown their peers yet. They've only really had this big result, and then they've got smashed in a lot of the other matches they've played against the elite tier that I've listed here, and they've had some decent placings, but it's never been by beating those elite tier teams. Can they play at a very high level with some degree of consistency? No, they haven't. They've gotten smashed in those matches, and they've made it like deep placings sometimes, but it wasn't always off the highest level of play. Can they win any tournament? I mean, even though they just won this one, no. This was a shock. This was a surprise. It was a surprise even to them to a degree. So yeah, well done, but we don't know that they can do it again yet. Are they favourites or among the favourites to win big tournaments that they enter? No, they wouldn't be. If there was a tournament with VP, Na'Vi, SK, Dignitas, then C9 would not be considered one of the favourites. You wouldn't have 5 favourites. It's already stretching it to say you got more than like 3 favourites, in my opinion. So they wouldn't be a favourite, and it wouldn't be reasonable to call them that. So there's an example of how it goes. Now, the good thing about this sort of term, and if you keep the criteria in your mind and you have a set criteria and you're consistent with how you use it, like I am, it allows you to not only model who the elite teams are, but then to keep a track of who those absolute best, what that peer group of really, really top level teams are. So, I mean, I used a similar method for players as well, by the way. I only call them elite players when I think they're at a really high level. But obviously the criteria for players is different than winning tournaments, because that's a team criteria, because it's a team result. So what's good, I think, about having this elite tier is it allows you to keep track of teams. So that means that you're looking for teams that are going to drop out. So SK, for example. You're looking for teams that might be able to enter it. So Cloud9, NIP, these are obvious examples at the moment. It also teaches you to define your criteria for what you think is the most important, what makes up the best teams and what makes them the best, and then to determine where a team is at with that criteria to know where their head trajectory is headed. Are they going to go up if they win the next event? Are they going to go down if they win one? Are they in threat of not getting it? Are they already safe with their status because they made it top 2 here even if they don't win? It's really good to do this sort of thing because it'll make you really be honest with how you're thinking, to try and compare how you're thinking to how you do in other instances when you may like or dislike a team in comparison, but you look at the factors, and it will also allow us to know, rather than just saying tier 1 and being like, oh yeah, well, they're a tier 1 team, like, and 10 other teams in the world of that. We have the best teams, and when someone says elite tier, elite team, they really know what that means.